On the first day of infection, we won't find anything. Our immunity is working and we're trying to stop that infection. I believe in the theory that people who have those characteristics of a healthy lifestyle, a balanced diet, and also take supplements, make their immune system really strong and working. I think there are many people I know who have those characteristics and say, I'm in contact, I should have gotten infected, I should have an immune response, and they have nothing. It's possible that their innate response, their innate immunity, blocked the virus from the very beginning. It doesn't even reach the point where the adaptive immunity has to produce antibodies, because it has only gotten to the early stages of what would be a small control inflammatory response. So in those first few days, we won't find either the virus or antibodies. In the incubation phase, as we mentioned before, 3, 4, 5, or 6 days before symptoms, we can already find some variants through PCR. There, the technique of choice is PCR. In the days of the first symptoms, the techniques of choice will be PCR and total antibodies, as I mentioned before. The two techniques will be very complementary, so that no patient goes undiagnosed. From there, IgA and IgM will rise, and we can choose either total antibodies. From those 4 or 5 days onwards, the ovals will always appear, of course, and from day 7 and day 8 of the symptoms, we can already detect the IgA and the IgM, and the IgG will appear much later. But well, sometimes we don't know how long someone has had symptoms because there are people who tell me they don't even know when they started. So, in these cases, measuring all 3 immunoglobulins, or at least total antibodies, could be a good choice of technique to see where we stand, whether they've developed more immunity or are still in the initial infection. Well, here it's very interesting to be clear that this seroconversion towards improvement starting from day 7, or the worsening of the disease, would be very interesting to measure. Immunoglobulins along with an inflammatory profile, which I'll discuss now. Why do I say this? Well, look, just this weekend, a friend, a fellow doctor, passed away because he spent 7 days at home waiting to see if his symptoms would improve. By the time he realized, it was too late. And when he was admitted to the ICU, there was nothing that could be done. So what's happening? Starting from day 7 of the infection, there may be people who evolve favorably and everything goes well, which is the most normal outcome. That everything goes well and the infection ends like any other mild infection. Or for reasons we've discussed before, their infection could progress to a critical, acute phase that could end fatally. What do I propose here? So for those people who have symptoms, especially if they're at risk, we should measure both immunoglobulins and the inflammatory profile to understand how they're evolving, whether it's going to improve or if there's a possibility of complications. And we need to take measures beforehand before they end up needing to be admitted to the ICU. Well, when we start to see an increase in IgG immunoglobulins and the presence of IgA and IgM is decreasing, then we can measure IgG and total antibodies if you want, at the same time as IgG, just to see what concentrations we have. And well, what we are seeing, and I see it very often, is quite curious. But we've already seen studies in Korea discussing these cases. We're finding people who no longer have IgM. They don't have IgA. They've only developed IgG, meaning they seem to be immunized, and yet their PCR is still coming back positive. Well, that's possible. The articles are quite clear that this positive PCR is responding to remnants of the virus's RNA. These remnants of the virus's RNA that haven't disappeared from our body, from the patient's body, are still being detected by PCR. Let's not forget that this polymerase chain reaction technique amplifies a piece of the virus's RNA, meaning it amplifies it in such a way that it can find a tiny bit of the virus that might be in the patient's nasopharynx. And also, well, that piece of RNA could correspond to a live virus or a dead virus. So we're detecting genetic material, not a viable virus, not a living bug, but genetic material. And also, well, that virus, that piece of RNA, could correspond to a live virus or a dead virus. We're detecting genetic material. It could be alive or dead. If IgG is positive and PCR is positive, it's likely due to non-infectious RNA. Then he can be alive or dead. And in cases where IgG is already positive, like some patients I've known who have been through the infection for 2.5 months, who have no symptoms but still have a positive PCR, it likely has to do with that RNA that is no longer infectious, meaning those people aren't considered to be contagious. Well, when we're already immunized, if what we want later on is to know, say in October, if I still have an immune response, or memory in my blood out of curiosity, or because the doctor requested to see if someone is at risk or not, then ideally, for someone who has already had contact, it would be best to just test for IgG. This is the inflammatory profile. As I mentioned before, it's a simple profile done in the lab, and we can actually get results on the same day, except for interleukin-6, which isn't as common unless everyone were to get this profile done. And then we could have it much quicker or with more urgency. All the other tests are routine in a lab like ours, like any lab, and results can be given on the same day. In other words, someone who has doubts, who is in the early days, symptoms, is at risk, and wants to know how they're going to evolve, this would be a pretty reliable profile to see how their illness is going to progress and to take measures as soon as possible without waiting for things to get worse. Do you see the enogram decreases, lymphocytes, proteins reactivate, tensinases increase, D-dimer rises, protamine decreases, ferritin also increases, and interleukin-6 rises significantly. This would be the preferred profile to do for those people who have symptoms and come in to get their immunoglobulins or even the PCR to find out if they have COVID or not. I also got this chart from Carlos Tercero's latest publication. And well, I was telling you a bit about the same thing we've been discussing, what the phases would be. Well, I would put down here what I mentioned: positive PCR, negative IgM, and IgA, and positive IgG. Here we're talking about virions, dead ones, and remnants of RNA, okay? We've already discussed this table, so I won't go over it again since we've covered it in the previous review. So, how are we going to interpret the results? If we have a PCR and negative IgA, IgM, and IgG antibodies, we can say that there has been no contact with the virus or that we are at the beginning of an incubation period. We can never say, oh, how great, I'm negative, I don't have anything. It's not like, oh, great, I'm negative, but be careful because you don't know when you might have gotten infected. If you've been infected and you don't know if you're in an incubation period, meaning you won't have symptoms for a few days. So pay attention to these cases. When the PCR is positive and total antibodies are negative, and there are no symptoms, be careful because we're in an incubation period. It's an early detection of the infection. If the PCR is positive and total antibodies are positive, but IgG is negative, we are dealing with an active infection. This person is indeed in the active phase of the infection. Be careful, because there are people who, even with mild symptoms, are very infectious at this moment. They don't know it, but they're very infectious and they think it's just an allergy rhinitis. As a man told me, I thought he had an allergy. But no, he was going through a COVID infection. And when we have a negative PCR and positive total antibodies, and also IgG is already positive, we can talk about a favorable evolution because that PCR has turned negative, and those positive total antibodies are definitely due to the IgG. Since not everyone does total antibodies, we also wanted to include here how to interpret either positive IgM and IgA or positive total antibodies with a negative IgG when doing the ELISAs. This is an active infection. Okay, IgM or IgG or IgA, or positive total antibodies, accompanied by a negative Ig indicates an active infection. If we have positive total antibodies with a positive IgG, we're at a point of seroconversion, which is a favorable evolution. If a lab doesn't do total antibodies but tests for IgG, IgM, and IgA, and those are negative while the IgG is positive, it's the same thing, seroconversion or favorable evolution. We're already in a good situation where the infection has ended and we're at a point of immunity. If the IgM and IgA are negative, the IgG is positive, and the PCR is positive, I'll say it again, it's the same case as before, the case of that person who still has remnants of RNA in their body that have been detected. And since it amplifies so much, it shows up as positive, but they are no longer infectious.